Yeah, so you get things like January 6th, and at what point in the future can that sort of snowball into states refusing to recognize election wins in competitive states?
139 people in the House voted after the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021, against certifying the duly elected Biden elected.
You know, they're like cannibalizing each other on the House floor, almost getting into fistfights, hollering at each other between McCarthy and a few of his Republican followers like Richard Hudson, Mike Rogers, Matt Gaetz.
This is a freak show. This is going to be a clusterfuck for the next 2 years.
This is the bigger macro problem here. We've got a party that has embraced white supremacy, and they want to sort of, in an eliminationist way, have a one-party system.
Welcome to episode 141 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. In our first episode of 2023, we're sharing a conversation I had yesterday with historian Paul Street and political scientist Anthony DiMaggio regarding the second anniversary of the January 6th coup attempt, the January 6th Commission report, and the GOP shutting down the House. But first, if you appreciate this show and want to help us reach more people who want to refuse fascism, go be a gem and write a review and drop 5 stars wherever you listen to your pods. Tell the people out there in podcast land why you love us. Thank you. Subscribe, follow so you never miss an episode, and of course, continue all that great sharing and commenting on social media. Okay, so today we are going to get right to the interview, but I wanted to add a note on the everlasting role of the Donald in relation to the Speaker of the House shutdown. Trump explicitly came up in a number of ways through this fight. After McCarthy won the House speakership, he said, quote, "I don't think anybody should doubt his influence," end quote. Later in the interview, he stated something that I think we really need to pay attention to. Quote, "He was with me from the beginning and he was all in. He would call me and he would call others," end quote. Later in the interview, he talks about talking to him the night of the final vote and the critical role that he played in getting those final votes. At the same time, it shouldn't be lost on anyone that Matt Gaetz, the most fanatical disruptor, nominated Trump himself for the speakership at one point. Marjorie Taylor Greene was running around the House floor with a direct line to Trump, putting him right in the center of the action, right into the ears of key players trying to convince them to get on board with McCarthy. But it's also important to look at the whole picture. These folks started a garbage fire at a circus and then somehow used that to violently advance their agenda. This is one of Trump's signature moves and something that Trump opened the door for. With that, here is my interview with Paul and Anthony. It's been 2 years since Trump's rolling coup turned into insurrection at the Capitol, and the maggots haven't backed down or been defeated. They've been building power and honing their strategies 2 years, and the GOP has only gotten more fascist. The lie of the stolen election has gotten more entrenched, and the divisions have sharpened and deepened. We at Refuse Fascism continue to advocate that we can't rely on the courts or elections, that it's up to all of us to refuse fascism. To get into this, I am so glad to welcome back to the show, Paul and Tony. Paul, my friend and fellow member of the Refuse Fascism editorial board, is an independent progressive policy researcher, an award-winning journalist, historian, and author. His latest book is This Happened Here, Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America. And I am also super excited to welcome back Anthony DiMaggio. He is an associate professor of political science at Lehigh University. His latest book is Rising Fascism in America it can happen here. Welcome back, both of you. Glad to be chatting with you.
Thanks for having us.
So we have the anniversary of January 6th just happening yesterday. We have the release of the final January 6th Congressional Commission report. You've both written about the report, and I do really want to get into both of your pieces. But first, 2 years later, what do you think are the most important takeaways? Where does the insurrection of January 6th stand in U.S. history? What shadow is it casting over today? And where are we at right now in relation to the threat embodied in this attack? I'd love to hear from Tony first.
One of the big takeaways from January 6th is that we shouldn't be looking at just 1,000 people who occupied a building and assaulted an election. We should be looking at what this means for the Republican Party more broadly. You have a party now where the vast majority of members don't recognize the legitimacy of elections. Now, we know that there's always been problems with U.S. elections. We commonly use the terms like bourgeois democracy to suggest that democracy is not very good in terms of being very plutocratic. But that's certainly better than a dictatorship, or less bad. So when you get to the point where an entire major political party doesn't recognize the legitimacy of those elections, there's really no way to know for sure how bad that's going to get, what the full implications are going to be. Yeah, so you get things like January 6th, and at what point in the future can that sort of snowball into states refusing to recognize election wins in competitive states, battleground states, red states? And then you're talking about an entirely broken electoral system, one that before functioned relatively well, at least in terms of the nuts and bolts of vote counting and the lack of evidence of any sort of systemic voter fraud. I think that's one of the really big sort of points and takeaways here, that this hasn't really been dealt with, despite the fact that there was a January 6th commission, which did a very good job of trying in a narrow way to spot and identify and expose what Donald Trump did in terms of trying to manipulate an election and stoking insurrectionists. And then there's a sort of deeper question, which maybe we can talk about later, which is where all of this big lie election fraud propaganda is coming from. And it's not just simple authoritarianism. I think it has a deep-seated level with white supremacy, the mainstreaming of great replacement theory, and people scared out of their minds of becoming, quote, minority in their own country. So that's something I think we should dive into too.
We'll be sure to do that. Paul, what are your thoughts?
Well, we still seem to be in denial about the problem of fascism. And I've noticed there was a brief upsurge of the use of the word because Joe Biden had kind of semi-legitimized it, and it seems to be gone again. I've been sort of paying attention to this in the New York Times and the Washington Post. I mean, let's get real here. This was something that many of us predicted and saw from the beginning with Trump. You can go back and find some just original predictions that there will be a coup attempt. Timothy Snyder, as early as April 2017 in Salon, it's sort of implicit in a piece, not by a Marxist like myself, but by just a kind of nice liberal writer named Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker, in a piece called Going There with Donald Trump in May of 2016. A lot of us saw this long before. Of course, Refuse Fascism, I remember talking immediately about Trump's response to the 2020 election as a rolling coup. I mean, so let's be real here about what January 6th was. It was this sort of physical culmination of an ongoing rolling coup that was written into the neo-fascist Christian white nationalist nature of the Trump phenomena, and really, as Tony was suggesting, his party from the beginning was an attempted overthrow of previously normative bourgeois constitutional electoral and rule of law democracy. One of the really neat things about the January 6th report, and it is a narrow and in some ways a legal document overlaid with all kinds of establishment political and ideological kind of constraints, but it really does document blow by blow, almost in an overkill kind of way. It would almost be boring to read if it wasn't documenting an attempted overthrow of capitalist democracy, of a coup attempt, of a many-sided coup attempt, fake electors, attempted intimidations of state legislatures to falsify their election counts, Trump actually inviting and sparking and provoking a violent mob, actually trying to get people who he knew were armed with assault rifles to be admitted to the march on the Capitol. One of the things from the report that I will never forget, and it was in the original testimony, was Trump saying, take down the metal detectors. Basically, the guys with the AR-15s don't want to hurt me. I mean, with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters, explicitly fascist organizations in the quasi-military lead and breaking the windows and providing the entrance for the Christian white nationalist Confederate flag flying mob, and being egged on in the middle of the assault by Trump continuing his attack on Pence and essentially greenlighting calls for hanging Mike Pence. And here's this guy who could never shut up for 4 years, just this constant propagandistic diarrhea of deception and malignant narcissism and white nationalism and nativism and hatred and authoritarianism, all of a sudden has nothing to say for, what was it, more than 3 hours? Just sitting there licking his chops and finally having to sort of say something very weak. The report is very good on this fascist attack and the people around Trump, that it really was a coup attempt. It was a serious coup attempt. And it started before the election and continued all the way up through January 6th. The attempts even continued afterward. But the report can't once ever anywhere say fascism, which I wouldn't really expect them to lead with that, or to the word to appear once. But you can do a word search on the January 6th document. The word never appears, even in a passive, kind of descriptive kind of way. This report runs 845 pages, and not even once can the Proud Boys or the Three Percenters or the Oath Keepers be even sort of secondarily and descriptively referred to accurately as fascist organizations. And that really strikes me as bending over backward to not say that word. You can barely even see racism showing up in the report. It's really just extraordinary. They're just extremists and they're kind of crazy and they're wacky and it's scary. But to specify the ideological character of what they were about is just not there.
Tony, can you talk a little bit more about this white supremacy aspect that was totally absent from the report? And why does that matter? I forgot to mention this at the beginning. I do want to echo a lot of what Paul was saying about the substance that was in the report. And it is also unprecedented that such a commission has made the recommendation that a former president, who just happens to still be the GOP frontrunner, and some of the co-conspirators never be allowed to hold political office again. That actually is significant. And that they recommended prosecution for committing multiple felonies. So I didn't want to step over that. But I think that it is worth looking at. You both spoke to this being, a legal document and there being reasons why certain things were framed the way they were. But what impact does it have that the central role of white supremacy was absent in the document?
Well, it's a good question. I think we should clarify, just to be totally clear, that it did come up. It just didn't come up very much. There were like 7 references and 800 plus pages to either white nationalism or white supremacy, and none to fascism, as Paul was talking about. And if we can understand why, we can understand what the implications are, because I think they're related. In terms of the why, we have to sort of come to some conclusions, external observers, because we haven't had a chance to interview any of these people, and we're not going to, not us three at least. But, so someone like Jamie Raskin and other people, Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger on this committee will have to speak for themselves. I don't think that they'll be asked, because the question of white supremacy hasn't really been discussed in terms of the news media, political leaders, academics. They should answer for it, but they're not going to. And I think that that's sort of getting to the answer here, because there's a larger culture of denialism that Paul is talking about. It's not just of fascism, but of white supremacy more broadly. It's such a weird thing that in the United States, white supremacy was openly advocated, celebrated as a virtuous thing prior to the civil rights movement. People didn't mince words about it. Certainly they tried to pretty it up. The Klan, for example, they used to talk about it as a protectionist impulse, white supremacy, against those dangerous black men who want to assault women and so on. But they were open about being white supremacists and keeping Jim Crow segregation. And since the civil rights era, it has become so much more difficult. In some ways, it's sort of like the success of that movement has been part of, I don't want to say it's undoing, but it's created real challenges, because now nobody's a racist. Everybody was a racist, and now nobody's a racist. You've got people like Richard Spencer, David Duke, people affiliated with the Klan, alt-writers who openly issue Sig Heils to their fans and their audiences. And no, they're not fascists. They're not white supremacists. They dress nice and they get a clean haircut. And so if you get it to that point in a country where even the Richard Spencers and the David Dukes are trying to argue that they're not racist and not white supremacist, you have a country that's delusional. That is a delusional country. This is the only issue in the United States that has stoked a civil war, racism, slavery, white supremacy. It's a hugely divisive issue. It's always been a divisive issue, and people like to pretend that it isn't. And so, I think when you look at this, it's not so much an individual like a Jamie Raskin type, because he's smart. He knows that these people were fascists. He has acknowledged it in the committee hearings. But we should also understand that this is a product of groupthink, these kinds of reports. So you've got an entire committee. You've got people like Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, and more moderate Democrats who are part of the American exceptionalism and denialism, and they don't want to recognize that these things are real, to an absurd point where you can't even refer to Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and Groyper Army people and alt-righters as fascists or white supremacists. And so there's a silly game going on here where people know better. Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Jamie Raskin, but for the sake of appearances and for the sake of this culture of denialism, these things get buried. And so what's the implication? The implication is that we can't have an honest discussion about this stuff in the mass culture because people don't want to address these things, because it makes people feel uncomfortable to talk about things like structural racism, about white supremacy, about mainstreamed hatred and bigotry and fascism. And so we don't have these discussions. So it's kicking the can down the road. And it really just means that these problems will continue to persist, and we won't be able to sort of address them until people get more realistic about what's going on.
Paul, you want to share any thoughts?
I will just sort of tail on that a little bit and agree with Tony that some of these liberal elites know very well what's going on. In fact, Obama, on the eve of Trump's election, said to Timothy Kaine, this has been reported, hey, Tim, this is no time to be a purist. You've got to keep a fascist out of the White House. It's an extraordinary kind of thing. And Hillary Clinton was near the phone and nodding along. Jamie Raskin, during one of the hearings when he was praising the Capitol police officers, said, you guys are heroes. You stood up against fascist traitors. I think the two main personalities on the committee were probably Raskin on one hand, who's kind of a constitutionalist law professor, wonder kind, who goes back to Harvard and the Yale Law Review forever, who's very liberal, and then Liz Cheney, who very much had an agenda on this committee of trying to discredit just Trump. And you can see her influence there of trying to suppress a serious discussion of the underlying white nationalism and patriarchy that are at the core of her party, and which she still advances. She voted mainly with Trump during the whole time, but she hates the individual himself, and she still sort of clings to the old bourgeois constitutional republic and wants to carry out the neoconservative white nationalist agenda still within a small R Republican framework. And I think between those two, and also the kind of narrow legalistic goal of setting up these formal criminal referrals and sending them to the Justice Department, lead to a very kind of formalistic, narrow downplaying of the kinds of bigger questions that concern left, Marxist, progressive, political scientists and historians like the people you're talking to right now. They have a very different agenda than the full many-sided truth-seeking that I think we're engaged in here, that informs my politics and refutes fascism.
I would just push to say that it concerns everyone. And I think that goes back to what was the role of this committee in the report, then what is the role of people who are seeking the truth and trying to advance people understanding what happened and what's continuing to happen. And those are different because it was not coming from, we're going at this to have a complete picture of the day in the service of advancing the interests of humanity. If people were talking about this as a fascist threat, what difference would that make? And I just wanted to get your last thoughts on that and then move the conversation forward from there. But what difference do you think it would have made if it were correctly named as a fascist coup attempt?
That would mean that we require mass mobilization. You can't just vote fascists out of power. That would mean what Refuse Fascism called for throughout the entire Trump administration, which was a Puerto Rican-style mass rebellion, which would have been a game changer. The goal was to get rid of the whole Trump-Pence regime, right? But also to fundamentally and qualitatively alter the political and social terrain from the bottom up through mass action upon which both parties were operating, and would have led to, I think, a disciplining of the post-Trump Biden administration, and would have led to a sense of a kind of different politics beneath and beyond just the quadrennial big money, major party candidate-centered, corporate crafted, winner-take-all electoral extravaganzas that are sold to us as the only politics. We were trying to create a different kind of politics. There should have been masses in the streets to block the original MAGA demonstrations in December of 2020 that preceded January 6th. There should have been a call of the masses into the streets to block all this insanity. Of course, this took place during COVID and actually at the height of COVID. People were very scared of mass actions at this time. There was a disappearance of the people from the streets as the election drew closer and afterwards. The last sort of great gasp that I can remember was in connection with the shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And then really from Kyle Rittenhouse on, that was it. And everything got poured into the elections and into the killing confines of an electoral system that is tilted to the right, even without all the voter suppression, already by the absurdly malapportioned Senate, by the badly gerrymandered House, by the free flow of right-wing campaign finance, none of which is addressed in the report.
Now, I wanted to go back to the committee to get Anthony's thought on this one aspect. After the insurrection was defeated, the Democrats took over both the White House and both houses of Congress, and there was a big, if informal, push to go back to brunch or to pull an Obama style, let's look forward, not backward, and almost forget that this ever happened. And the fascists still had significant power, even as a minority. And there was no guarantee of any kind of committee. There's much to be said about the involvement and lionization of Liz Cheney, which you both spoke to. What do you think the role of this committee and report have been or will be in terms of their role in making a case for accountability?
Well, that's one thing that you could say that the report did a pretty decent job at in terms of officially calling on prosecution for, at least for Trump, at least. I mean, within the narrow sense of focusing on him stoking insurrectionists and trying to sort of manipulate the outcome in Georgia, however many, it was like 11 or 12,000 votes he said he needed from Brad Raffensperger. This idea that he violated federal law, that he should be prosecuted. On numerous cases, charges could be brought against him in terms of stoking insurrection, number one, which is illegal under national law, and also the idea of extortion in the context of an election. I don't think that is necessarily something that I was disappointed with this particular report, because they did sort of confront it head on. I'm more disappointed in how quiet the Biden administration has been this whole time, because Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, Biden himself, right, he hasn't really said much about the looming threat outside of one speech he did talking about big lie propaganda before the midterm election. And that was very, very narrowly sort of motivated for votes. That's a real issue that there doesn't seem to be the impetus within the Democratic Party. Again, would take the issue with this committee as much because they did explicitly call for that. But within the context of the Democratic Party, there hasn't been any pressure. And I think that the reason for that is because, as Paul said, there hasn't been a mass movement. So I've been calling for a long time. And in my book on Rising Fascism, I talk about this in the conclusion. There needs to be not just a mass mobilization, but, it needs to include many different facets of American society, like transformation in the educational institutions and how we teach history and sensitize people to what fascism is so they can identify it today. Academics taking this more seriously in terms of studying white supremacy and fascism. The media making these into serious conversations, including progressive media, which I think haven't done enough oftentimes to talk enough about fascism and white supremacy too. Without this kind of mass pressure, people like Garland just aren't feeling it in terms of the idea that they have to really take this more seriously and push. There should be some sort of reporting by now. There's been some kind of action, or that they're taking it seriously. I haven't really heard anything. It's been really crickets. That's a sign that the party, more so than the committee, really hasn't taken this seriously at the highest levels in terms of taking action for accountability.
The recommendation, the key policy recommendation, it comes out on the eve of the Republican-Fascist Party taking over the U.S. House, which means essentially the end of the Select Committee investigation. And by the way, all this kind of smug schadenfreude about November and how we won the midterm, they lost the U.S. House. And not just because of gerrymandering. They lost the U.S. House popular vote by 3 million votes. All this self-congratulatory, wow, we kicked ass, look at these crazy Republicans from the dismal dollar-drenched Democrats is really kind of depressing to behold, but it's predictable. Have you noticed watching this fiasco now in the House, the smug looks on all the liberal commentators like, oh, we won. And it's like, this is great. It's like they liked it. This is a freak show. This is going to be a clusterfuck for the next 2 years. And where the document works is as a very formal legal criminal referral. I think that's right. It goes to justice. I don't know if they're going to act on this or not. I mean, I've been hearing that Trump is dead and that Trump is doomed for 6 years now. It makes a very strong legal case. But the one main policy recommendation, that the House and that Congress strip Trump of the right to run for federal office again, they know that has a snowball's chance of hell of passing in the Congress that they've just handed over to the GOP. And whether the legal referrals will work is sort of in the ball court of Merrick Garland. And I don't know what goes on in that guy's mind and what he's going to do. We will see. As Trump likes to say, we'll see what happens.
It is. We will see what happens. I'm not saying that accountability for Trump would be meaningless, and I don't want people to interpret what I'm saying as such. I think it would be important. But because it was so zeroed in on Trump, the party that facilitated this, that fostered it, that fomented it, that was in step with it, was let off the hook. If there's no accountability, no challenge of that, then it's going to keep going. I am so glad that we didn't do this conversation midweek, not only because I was exhausted, but we wouldn't have been able to discuss the madness that was the speaker vote, one that all too many just like popped the popcorn and sat back laughing at, even while what it proved was that January 6th never ended. Refuse Fascism wrote earlier in the week on Twitter, don't let the speaker vote circus obscure the fact that this is one more opportunity the fascists are seizing on to push the limits of their power as hard and as far as possible. And whoever wins, this will raise the profile of the most hardcore maggots in the House. Now, since that was written, Kevin McCarthy, as of late last night, did, in fact, on his 15th attempt, win. I was looking at some interesting things in terms of the connection between January 6th and this speaker vote. And Lucian Trescott for Salon.com had something that I found very helpful. He wrote, quote, nearly every member who has opposed McCarthy for speaker cast voted against certifying the election in the early hours of January 7th, 2021, after rioters had shut down the process on the afternoon of January 6th. See if any of these names are familiar. Boebert, Gaetz, Biggs, Cloud, Good, Bishop, Gosar, Perry, Rossendale, Miller, Harris, Donalds, Norman. One of the gang opposing McCarthy up until the 13th ballot was Eli Crane of Arizona, a freshman just elected who has proudly attended rallies celebrating the insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And quote, I wanted to see, what are you thinking? What do you say to people who watched this circus with popcorn saying shit like this? At least the Republican Party is severely fractured. In the long run, I don't see how they survive from this. What would you say?
I don't see them as fractured. I mean, this is very clearly a win for the Trump, DeSantis, QAnon, neo-fascist. Take your pick of descriptors. Kevin McCarthy is clearly on bended knee here. This is very clear that you're talking about a speaker who's going into this deeply hobbled in terms of the ability to remove him at any time, who's had those powers removed that the speaker traditionally enjoyed. Trump has been the leader of this party for the last half decade. Nobody really dared cross him during his time in office. And now it's getting to the point where it could be Trumpism without Trump. You know, if DeSantis sort of takes over someone like that, you've got the Paul Gosars, the Lauren Boeberts, the Matt Gaetzes. One of these people has been implicated in having sex with underage children. And so, this is not a real party. This is not a parliamentary party in the normal sense of the word. And they have prevailed. And they have prevailed not just because of these people and the cult of personality surrounding them, but also because of the media system that's been in place for decades that has stoked full outrage, conspiratorialism, anger, white nationalism, paranoia, with people like Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, the white nationalist. And so this is a phenomenon. You know, Trumpism existed before Trump and will exist after him. It has taken over this party, undisputably at this point. It's just so far beyond even a discussion. I think that's a sign of desperation when people are trying to sort of laugh about this and make light of it and say, well, you know, they're like cannibalizing each other on the House floor, almost getting into fistfights, hollering at each other between McCarthy and a few of his Republican followers like Richard Hudson, Mike Rogers, Matt Gaetz. Sure, yeah, they're fighting with each other, but the battle's been won, and that's where we're at. I don't know how you get past that as a country outside of that party imploding, outside of people not being willing to vote for them anymore, and these people getting isolated, or some kind of mass movement, or both. Without those things, this party's going to continue to sort of move along because there's only two major parties, and there's a lot of people, tens of millions of them, who are willing to normalize this party, no matter how far it falls, there's no floor. This was 2/3 of Trump's supporters who said there's never anything he could do that would make them not support him. And he's still the front runner. I don't think much has changed. If there's anything that's changed, it's simply that you have a lot of liberals and Democrats in America who hate Donald Trump and Trumpism, and you have quite a few moderates, some people in between, who were really turned off by January 6th and by Trump, and they have sort of decided they don't really want to support him. So that's a lot of people, sure, but it's still a deeply divided country, right? And one of those two main parties is still in control with a fascistic white nationalist politic. I don't see much reason to celebrate that. At best, you could say that we've sort of stepped back from the precipice of a looming coup moving into 2024 if we don't have these wackadoodle Republican secretaries of state who didn't win, by the way, who might not certify a win for a Democrat in that state. So that's good, I guess, or less horrible that we've stepped away from the looming crisis that was within a year or two of happening. But that doesn't really deal with the larger problem of one of the two major parties in this alleged democracy being totally dysfunctional, broken, and embracing QAnon-style neo-fascism.
Let me just backtrack a little bit and say, Sam, that you had mentioned something about the Democrats' inability to deal with the overall fascism of the GOP. That while this chaos is going on, appropriately enough, in the House floor on January 6th, Biden is having a bipartisan love fest and reaching out to with his arms around Mitch McConnell, who he is referring to as, like a partner in proper governance. Mitch freaking McConnell is the guy who led the prevention of allowing Obama to appoint a Supreme Court justice, and then who participated in the rapid fire approval of handmade Amy Coney Barrett with just weeks leading up to the election, which in turn sets us up for the decision on last June 24th, abolishing women's constitutional right to an abortion. And by the way, this court, which is created by McConnell, who Biden is putting his arms around, is hearing Moore v. Harper, has heard the oral arguments for Moore v. Harper, which may permit red states to veto the 2024 presidential election in states by invalidating electors coming out of red states if state legislatures determine that the vote has gone the wrong way. I don't want to get too far down into the weeds of Moore v. Harper, but Tony, it does not require the secretaries of state. And the Moore v. Harper decision, it lets Republican-led state legislatures themselves cancel popular votes. And I think that's a key point. On this insanity in the House, I noticed the media referring to the 20 crazy arch neo-fascists as the conservative. Things have gone so far to the right, we're reduced to seeing Kevin McCarthy and Paul Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene as the lesser evil. Are you kidding me?
First moderates they'll tell you.
Moderates now, right. Gaetz and his crowd are the conservatives. No, they're the super crazy neo-fascists fighting against the more run-of-the-mill moderate fascists. The 139 people in the House voted after the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021, against certifying the duly elected Biden electors. There's a bunch of neo-fascists in the McCarthy side, including crazy nutjob fascist Paul Gosar. And where's that guy Perry from Ohio, the House guy who's all over the January 6th report, who's centrally involved in the assault, the attempt to bring about fake electors and on and on. A lot of the schadenfreude that you're hearing from the smug liberals and the liberal media is that it's just pure aimless, crazy, out of control chaos. They don't know how to govern. They don't really want to.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I wanted
to phrase. They're not.
They can't govern. They can't govern. They can't govern.
What the hell?
As if they cared about it. As if they wanted to govern.
What do you think this Republican Fascist Party is all about? It's about pure destruction and anarchy and chaos, but they have a very real agenda. They really do. They want to end affirmative action. They want to end all civil rights. They want to roll back voting rights. They want to impose forced motherhood. They want to have a national abortion ban. They have a full right-wing neo-fascist agenda. They're not just aimless, and it's very consistent with January 6th, and it's a form of violence. And this little minority is sending a message to the fascist militias on the outside. Think about the message that's being sent there. Chaos is okay. They're having a kind of January 6th coup within the House of Representatives. They're sending out a message not completely unlike what Trump was sending out after the election. They're getting wild. And by the way, Here's a good January 6th parallel. What's the first thing they did when they took over the House? Even though I don't quite follow this because I keep hearing they hadn't taken over the House because they don't have a speaker, but somehow they were allowed, even before they had the speakership, to order, take down the metal detectors that were put up to the entrance to the House after January 6th. Does that sound familiar? Take down the metal detectors. That's what Trump said on January 6th. Let my fascist Proud Boys carry AR-15s up to the Capitol. So I guess this is to help Boebert bring in some of her assault weapons and bring them actually into the floor.
I wanted to just echo that one point. Even more hardcore fascist faction within the GOP brought the entire House to a halt. Anthony, you probably are going to correct me on the years that it was like 116 years since something like this happened, or like it never happened before. I think that was when it reached 10 votes. They were like, this hasn't happened in 116 years. I don't know. But basically,
mid-1800s, yeah.
Gaetz said that their goal, because for a while I was, what is their goal? Is their goal just chaos? Was to put a straitjacket on McCarthy, who, as Paul was getting at, is not a moderate. Concessions that McCarthy did grant some in order to get the votes to be the speaker. My understanding is that the concessions Mr. McCarthy offered to win over the first 15 holdouts included allowing a single lawmaker to force a snap vote at any time to oust the speaker, a rule that would codify a standing threat that he could be removed instantly if he crossed hard-right lawmakers. Also on offer was a commitment to give the far-right faction more control over who sits on key committees and a measure for open government spending bills to a freewheeling debate in which any lawmaker could force votes on proposed changes. If I missed something, please correct me. What can we expect to see happen as a result of these concessions? And now that the right tone of no holds barred free-for-all with fascists taking the initiative and setting the terms for everyone else to deal with.
We can expect more of the same in terms of this idea of the Republican Party as the party of no, but during the Obama years, it was the party of no in a parliamentary sense of just voting against things that the Democrats wanted. But now, we can expect nonstop sort of committee inquiries about Hunter Biden's laptop, Biden as a fascist because of an employer mandate for COVID vaccines, and any sort of other witch hunts you can imagine that they're going to cook up that really sort of fuel the eliminationism. This idea that the Democratic Party is some sort of Marxist revolutionary party set on destroying America and taking away this white majority and stoking this kind of outrage over them. I've heard people describe the Republican Party as some kind of insurgency. In some sense, that makes sense when you talk about the insurrectionists on January 6th. And I think it's just a continuation of that sort of politics within the House of Representatives. They want to tear it all down, right? And they want to get rid of the whole idea of even a two-party bourgeois democracy. And so at that point, with that kind of eliminationism, you're talking about the ideal being put forward here of authoritarian governing, fascist governing, of one-party sort of politics. Now, I don't think that that's sustainable in the long term because people aren't going to be governed by an ogre, by an authoritarian single party. So what's most likely to happen is some sort of national implosion if this keeps up. If you've got one of the two major parties that has decided that it's their way or the highway, we're going to rule and eliminate and destroy the other party, or we're going to burn it all down, which is where they're at. And that's not sustainable in a country that claims at least to be a democracy. There needs to be at least the facade of two parties and some sort of competitive choice, which there has been competition between the two parties for at least the presidency in recent decades. So if you get rid of that, you eliminate even sort of the pretense of some sort of formalistic democracy. And people in blue states aren't going to tolerate being sort of ruled over by a would-be dictator or an actual dictator. So yeah, I think we can see where this is going, a continuation of this sort of insurgency. I don't think it's going to end very well. And it's unfortunate that people haven't been able to be honest about what's driving it, which is the white supremacy to a large extent. This is what my recent research has been talking about, that this insurrection at its core was driven by the popularization and now the mainstreaming with Trump supporters of great replacement theory. This idea that people are scared to death, that they might become a minority in their own country, traces back to the mid-1960s with immigration reform. People don't realize that before 1965, and about 90% of Americans were white. It's closer to about 2/3 now because of a change in immigration law. And so this is fueling this whole alt-right, great replacement theory, white genocide propaganda. And it's at the core of not only what the insurrectionists were doing at the Capitol, but at the mass public as well. That's what my survey research has found, that this is a driving factor, the biggest factor in driving support and sympathy for the January 6th insurrectionists. So this is the bigger macro problem here. We've got a party that has embraced white supremacy, and they want to sort of, in an eliminationist way, have a one-party system. And moving forward, that's obviously not a sustainable thing unless you want to force some sort of national implosion or a dictatorship.
Paul, did you want to add anything to that?
I want to echo Tony's connection between January 6th and election denialism and white supremacism. And there's a lot of survey data, a huge overlap between approval for the Capitol riot and acceptance of the big lie of a stolen election on one hand, and belief in the necessity of protecting the great European values of our country, which is just sort of code language for keeping America white again. And one of the big things that has brought neo-fascism, or just flat out fascism, to the fore in the 21st century, it's kind of made the Sinclair Lewis scenario that didn't happen in the mid-1930s, which is sort of in some ways America's leftmost moment with the Second New Deal, that actually makes the Sinclair Lewis movement the second decade, third decade of the 21st century, is the demographics, is precisely the declining white percentage of the population, which just evokes a whole lot of fear amongst a whole bunch of Caucasians who I've labeled Amerikaners, taking the term from the South African pro-apartheid Afrikaners. I will add that Refuse Fascism, we said this, the empirical data matters and the survey data matters, so don't get me wrong, but we in Refuse Fascism said this immediately at the time. I recall saying it was just obvious that that's what was driving this notion that Biden's election was inherently illegitimate. The white Amerikaners just could not accept the fact that their candidate had lost, and they not completely incorrectly attributed Trump's defeat to non-white votes. That's true, to urban non-white votes and female votes and feminist votes, youth votes.
They don't matter because they were not human.
This is our country, and we're not going to give it away to them. You know, The Politics of Us and Them was at the subtitle of Jason Stanley's excellent book about fascist narratives. And I think the goal right now that they have, it's not just aimless. They want chaos. They want to disable the Biden administration. The House is very critical to all kinds of funding issues. There's issues with the debt ceiling. There's issues with the funding of the federal government. They're perfectly happy out of the pure pursuit of power to produce as much chaos as possible, which they hope will set up a 2024 victory.
I mean, I think that as things are now, they are headed towards atrocity. I don't think that you could say anything otherwise, but I think within this tumultuous, unprecedented conflict at the top, within the powers that be, and in fact, amongst the powers that be within the different sections, there's also an opportunity for people who hope to see a better world, who want to see a better world. But it does involve breaking out of a lot of really wrong, delusional thinking, including about the greatness inherent in this country, including that this is me personally speaking, not on behalf of Refuse Fascism, that democracy is the best we can do, that the notions that Tony was talking about, that somehow white supremacy is foreign to the American project. I think that these are just some of the many things that people need to break with. And as Paul, you were talking about, being able to look clear-eyed and to stop being delusional about the coming storm. I think all of that is important. This Lucian Truscott piece, I just thought was really an interesting read. I haven't read him in a while. And one of the other points that he had that I thought was worth noting in relation to this was he wrote, quote, "The fight this week in the House of Representatives is over the speaker election, but it's much larger than that. What it's really about is who will have the power to shut down the rest of the government, because what these people have done is what they want to be able to do more of in the future," end quote. And so I thought that that was really helpful in thinking about what are they going for and what is this all about. In terms of legislative priorities, it seems that they're aiming, if passed, for a package that would reinstate the Holman Rule, an obscure procedural rule that allows, quote, amendments to appropriations legislation that would reduce the salary of or fire specific federal employees or cut a specific program, end quote. As the Washington Post reported in 2017, the last time Republicans revived the Holman Rule, Democrats criticized the move because it threatened to upend the federal workforce. The package would also strike the Goebert Rule, which was put in place in 1979 to allow the debt ceiling to be raised without a separate vote. It has been suspended, repealed, and reinstated several times in the decades since. I wanted to talk to Paul about, Paul, your analysis of the mainstream, quote unquote, choice orgs in relation to all this. For example, you wrote, how grotesque and cynical for the Dems to win in November, which they didn't. The House of Republicans goes to Republic-Fascist in just a few days. How about that November? Women and girls had to lose a basic constitutional right, whose attainment through movement struggle had led to a dramatic improvement in women's opportunities and freedom. And I just wanted to get your thoughts. You spoke briefly on this earlier.
Well, the cynicism is just extraordinary that took place with the Democratic Party and their allied choice organizations, where they not merely surrendered in advance to the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, which undertook this historically unprecedented total slashing of a constitutional human and civil right, but actually sort of looked forward to it and banked on it. This was the strategy, as far as I could tell. I'm not sure the strategy completely failed. I do think the Democrats contained some of the damage they might have had in the midterm elections by running on supposed defensive road. The cynicism of that is just almost beyond belief. And I had personal discussions with Iowa Democrats where they pretty much said that much. We're looking forward to this decision. And, you know, the horror that has been inflicted, and it's very consistent with the neo-fascist overall agenda because patriarchy is a critical underpinning, but the horror that's being imposed on millions of women and girls across this country and transgendered pregnant people as well, of course, across this country is just unspeakable and is going under the radar screen, and the undermining of basic medical care for women and girls and transgendered people and others is also very problematic. So, you know, that's going on. In terms of the legislation that they're trying to get through on funding and staffing and so forth, you know, this is all part of the neo-fascist tear down the administrative state agenda that Bannon talked about. They don't really want to tear down the state. They want to shred the government's capacity. They want to tear down the left hand of the state, any part of government that does anything decent in terms of regulation and anti-poverty and environmental control and all of that. And we know from Axios that the right wing is just waiting for the next Trump or the DeSantis administration to fill the federal government, not just in its top cabinet offices, but all the way down into the many thousands of people with civil service appointments, to fill them with people who are vetted in advance for their politics, to fill basic administrative offices. They want to tear down the administrative state. They want to fill the administrative state with Christian white nationalists. That's what the real agenda is. You know, the right wing always claims to be anti-government. It's not. It's against government doing anything decent. It's against the left hand of the state. It wants to take over the government. It wants power. They want to take state power and they want to wield state power. I, from the Marxist, quote unquote, left, whatever the left is anymore, also want to seize and embrace and take state power, just for very, very different purposes than Steve Bannon and Paul Gosar and Ron DeSantis.
I wanted to close out by looping back to something that Tony had alluded to in relation to his book earlier, is how do we train people? How do we help teach people in this country to understand what is actually happening in relation to whether it be a January 6th or whether it be what happened in the House, to recognize what's important and what's driving these events?
It's a good question. I guess the broad answer is building a movement, but the simplest answer on an individual level is that people just need to do things. We have the benefit of Refuse Fascism as an organization, but there needs to be more organizations devoted to fighting fascism. But on an individual level, people need to be willing to, in all of these different circumstances in their life, draw boundaries between people who are trying to normalize fascist politics and say that they're not going to tolerate it, they're not going to indulge them. This requires conversations between family members, friends, colleagues at work. It requires people with privilege to be willing to say something. It's incredible how many academics and intellectuals and journalists and pundits just refuse to sort of deal with these issues of white supremacy and fascism, white nationalism. They're privileged people, right? And they could do a lot potentially, maybe even if there are these systemic boundaries, people can push back against them. Those people can be part of a mass movement. So it sounds sort of silly, but I think also incredibly important to say that people just need to do things. That's the first hurdle. You need to recognize that there's an actual threat. So we need to get past the denialism. And I think that a lot of people in the academy that I talk to, they do recognize that privately. You have these conversations with them and they recognize that things have gone off the rails. This is not a normal partisan system anymore. You have one party that's placating another party that's become fascist. And they're mainly timid and scared. They don't want to do anything. And they have to. People who are privileged to have the ability to sort of expose these things with evidence and data and historical context as teachers, as professors, as journalists, if they don't do it, then we're not going to get there because these are the people that have the resources that need to be part of this kind of movement. So we need people on the streets and we need more people to do that. But we also need people with resources to help sort of spotlight the lies and expose the problems. And it's not that hard. With a couple $1,000s in institutional funding, I was able to do a national survey with the Harris Group to expose the link between white supremacy and people's opinions of January 6th. So this is not difficult work. It can be done, and it can be done with relatively few resources if you have at least some skills and you're willing to do something. But until people are willing to do something, it really doesn't make sense to talk much about a movement from a pacified public that's not willing to start acting.
I want to jump on something Tony was saying there, which is there is this existential responsibility, I would say not just for academics, but for the professional class more broadly, to make some dramatic statements and step up here. One of the chapters of my book, This Happened Here, is a relentless attack on the just abject refusal of academics to acknowledge what was plainly in front of our face, which is that we had a fascist in the White House, that we had a guy in the most powerful office in the world who was in fact channeling and embodying neo-fascist ideology, politics, and policy. And some of this was about mistaken thinking, and some of this was just about intellectual illusion and fake Marxian notions that Trumpism was a populist working class revolt. I could go on with the intellectual mistake. A lot of it was cowardice. Cowardice, in some cases, on the part of people who are safely retired or are really safely ensconced in tenure-track positions. But even outside academia, we need a doctor or two or three, an OB-GYN, someone to step up and face a conviction and let themselves become the symbol of resistance to these terrorist forced motherhood prohibition bills somewhere in a red state, in Arkansas or Missouri, or somewhere like that. We do need people to step up. I would like to start a GoFundMe to get parachuted into some of these red states that have passed laws against the accurate teaching of American history and start calling and holding and organizing for the real history that your K-12 teachers aren't allowed to teach. Wouldn't that be something to start a campaign and actually teach the real American history of slavery and ethnic cleansing and labor violence and assault on labor organizers, to tell the real story of American history? There's a book coming out right now, very soon, out of Monthly Review Press, called Endless Holocaust, and it goes through one Holocaust after another. This is someone we should be helicoptering this guy into Iowa and taking him to a school district where the teachers are too scared to say anything. There's an urban studies professor that lives on my block at the University of Iowa, and when the critical race theory bill was passed through the Iowa State Legislature and signed by the governor, and the bill in Iowa goes all the way up from K to PhD. You're not allowed to talk seriously about sexism, racism. It's interesting I mentioned sexism, too, because if you actually look at a lot of these bills, they include talking about patriarchy, too. You're not supposed to talk about that either. I said, so what are you doing? How's this impacting you? What kind of resistance are you organizing? And, of course, she said, I'm just trying to stay under the radar screen. I don't want to get in any trouble. And I don't want to shame her completely, because there is a bill in the Iowa Senate. It's been there forever, and it keeps working to end tenure for academics at public universities in Iowa, at UNI, at Iowa State, and the University of Iowa. There's some real shit going on, and staying under the radar screen and hiding under your academic desk and using phrases like strongman and populism instead of fascism won't get us anywhere. There are sacrifices involved. And there would be a tax on tenure in this state.
Well, I want to thank you both for, as always, sharing your expertise, your perspective, your insights, and your time with us. It's always a pleasure. I'm going to put, as usual, links to all the good places to go to read more from Paul and Tony. Is there any other links I need to add?
Since this might be the first time since you've interviewed me that I've had
Substack.
I've had a Substack. It's called the Paul Street Report.
I would say thanks for having us, but also in terms of free resources, I'm getting published about half and half right now between Counterpunch and Salon.com. So if people are interested in either one of those, they can find the archive for stuff I'm working on related to fascism, white supremacy, and other issues.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, ideas for topics or guests. Share your art or lend a skill. Tweet me at Sam B. Goldman. Drop me a line at Samantha Goldman at refusefascism.org. Leave a voicemail by visiting anchor.fm/refuse-fascism and hitting the message button there. And you can also find us over at Mastodon at mastodon.world/@refusefascism. Want to support the show? It's simple. Show us some love by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice. And of course, follow, subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also literally put it on your forehead with our Refuse Fascism beanie available at refusefascism.org and start the conversation. Chip in to support our pod and content creation to help people understand and act to stop the fascist threat. Whether you can give $3 or $30, it all makes a difference in producing and promoting this independent weekly podcast. Give today by visiting refusefascism.org and hitting that donate button. Thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkelman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers. We have transcripts available for each episode, so be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. We'll be off next week, but we'll be back on January 22nd. Until then, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.